Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Out of Sight podcast, a podcast aimed at raising awareness about disabilities and special needs, and we explore areas of inclusion and accessibility within our community. Today we are joined by Dr. Sarfaraz Jarraj. Dr. Sarfaraz works professionally in the NHS as a clinical psychologist in the areas of depression, anxiety, and intersection between chronic physical health conditions and mental health, specializing in pain. He also works as a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Surrey. Sarfaraz has worked in the Muslim community as a facilitator, a mediator, and leader for 15 years and is particularly interested in self-development and well-being. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa
Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you wanted to speak quite a bit about inclusivity, but I just thought we should start off with defining what the term actually means.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. It's a privilege. And this is an area that's close to my heart. So, making sure we understand what we mean by inclusivity. I think sometimes to understand a term, it's useful to start with the opposite. And I guess the opposite of inclusivity is being excluded. And that's probably something most of us have had the experience of and can relate to at some point. And we know how being excluded can make us feel like an outsider, we're not being understood, we're not being heard, not being respected. And so I guess when we take that frame, inclusivity is really about people holding us in mind, about respecting us, about hearing us, about understanding us. And I guess that then leads to behaviors of kindness, of consideration, of caring. And that really helps us to separate from what can then become something that's, by virtue of not being inclusive, becomes exclusive and becomes quite discriminatory.
Okay, so are you saying that basically by having experienced feeling excluded, that's going to teach us how to be inclusive?
That's certainly a good starting point. There's so much we can talk for hours about what it is and come up with techniques for behavior change. But as a psychologist, and you don't have to be a psychologist to know that behavior change doesn't come really through understanding. It comes through feeling. So being able to connect with the feeling of being excluded helps you to understand what someone may be going through and motivates you to change your behavior so that actually you can be more inclusive.
Well, that's a very positive outlook, because in that case, I think we've all experienced feeling excluded, you, myself, probably everyone listening as well, throughout our life, for being Muslim or for being different colored skin or for having, maybe a disability or anything. Mm-hmm. We've all experienced it in some, way, shape or form.
And there's probably a limitation on that, particularly in the context of our discussion today when we have a focus on disability, where those of us who are able may have experienced different forms of exclusion, but what comes with our identities is a sense of power, depending on the color of your skin, your gender, your wealth, and there's a hidden level of powerlessness that exists with disabilities that most people won't be able to relate to. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and draw on some experience of being excluded in order to have a starting point to think about how is it that someone might be feeling when they're excluded, particularly with disability.
I think that's one of the main aims of this podcast anyway, is that obviously there isn't something that we've all experienced or a feeling that we all share and understand, but by opening up conversations and dialogue and speaking to various people, hopefully that's the aim, to raise awareness and try and get everyone to understand where we're coming from and where we're trying to get to.
Yeah, well, if we can get closer to that goal, then hopefully this will be an hour well spent.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. So when we speak about inclusivity, does this apply to everything? Is it about faith? Is it about race? What exactly is it? Is it just some kind of things or an overall outlook?
It's a great point. If you think about the society we live in, and I was just in discussing with some madrasa students this morning about living in the West, and what are some of the pros and cons of living in the West. And one of the things mentioned was about sort of freedom of speech and being inclusive. and then some of the students talked about, and maybe being over-inclusive. So maybe there are limitations within our faith about, where we draw the lines. Now, not being inclusive of everything doesn't mean you have to be discriminatory of something else. And I think there are nuances within that. I guess, for the purposes of our discussion today, what the areas I'd really like to focus on are, first and foremost, disability, but then, how that links to our broader mindset in terms of inclusivity around race, around culture, around faith, around gender, because these are all really relevant issues in our community.
Well, personally, I'm looking forward to hearing all about that, but just one word you used now, which was being over-inclusive. So what exactly does that mean?
So in our faith, we have lines around what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior in terms of lifestyles. So although you may have someone who, is engaged in extramarital affairs, who is engaged in alcohol use, drug use, people who may be persuaded in, with different sexual orientations. Those things fall, there are lines within our faith that we have to consider. So our discussion of inclusivity needs to be nuanced within the understanding of our faith.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because that's something that sometimes people struggle with, especially in the West, because inclusivity in itself is a very positive thing. And exactly like you said, it's the absence of discrimination, right? But then there is this extra push, which is just telling you to accept absolutely everything. And in some cases, even asking you to respect everything. And they sometimes mix and merge that with inclusivity, and it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about the word respect which I'd like to try and expand on as we go on a little bit later. But I think there's a point here to be made to say that just because you're not inclusive, it doesn't mean you have to be exclusive. Just because you're not being inclusive or taking into account a particular demographic or a group doesn't mean that you have to be discriminatory against them. And it's a fine line. And particularly with, I know this isn't our particular topic, but when it comes to the area of homosexuality, for example, I think it's really important to emphasize that, we have particular faith-based perspectives on its acceptability, but that does not mean that Islam is homophobic. And I think it's when people aren't cognizant of the nuances within how our faith works with different rules, that then people can kind of flip into areas of hatred, which isn't what Islam promotes.
And I think that's all based on education. It's very easy to hear something and just start believing it and, even parroting it and saying the exact same. But it's very important to go and do your own research and to understand everything, where your faith stands, and analyze what you're trying to be educated on before you just believe everything that you're told about your religion or even about things outside.
Absolutely. And I think maybe a fundamental, and this is the go-to for this whole kind of discussion today, is the value Islam places on human dignity. Whatever your background, whatever your difference, no one has the right to rob someone else of their dignity.
And that's a very Islamic faith-based perspective at looking at inclusivity. But I just want to break it down a lot. Why should we be inclusive? I know you said exclusivity leaves us feeling upset maybe or sad. But as a whole, why is inclusivity something that we should promote?
So I'd like to approach this from a few different levels. Intrapersonal level. So if I'm exclusive, what impact does it have on me? My nafs, my heart, what impact does it have on the person that I may be excluding? And then what impact does it have on a more societal level? So I guess just starting with, when we rob someone of their right to be included, we're transgressing a boundary, an ethical boundary within ourselves. And sometimes we may do that because of a lack of education or awareness, and it might be unintentional. But Zainab, as I'm maybe fiddling with my pen, and if it kind of slipped and it just kind of ended up going towards your face and it just kind of thwacked you in the head, that would be unintentional. I mean, here is probably a bit too close. It probably would be intentional, but I'm not going to do it.
I wouldn't be surprised.
If it just happened, in my excitement, something, it's unintentional, but would it hurt you?
Of course.
It would hurt you. Yeah. So, moving on from that intrapersonal, how it affects me and my nafs, is actually not being inclusive actually hurts people. And actually, that's outside of what we aspire to as Muslims. So on the first level, what it starts doing to me, and the more I do it, as we know from Surah Baqarah, just that little dark spot can then grow and grow and grow to a point where actually we start self-justifying and don't even recognize it as a transgression. Secondly, just causing someone else hurts, causing someone else pain, is outside of the bounds of what's reasonable, what's acceptable, certainly within our faith. But then, I guess, how it can then become part of society, how it can become a tradition or something acceptable in a community. And I'll give you an example of how it can start off feeling a little bit innocent, but actually can then become something more serious. So I'm from a Khoja background, and a joke Khojas often have is about the Pakistanis. Just not being as sharp, or just not being essentially as equal. Yeah, so maybe like how the English might have with the Irish, and it can often feel like this is just an innocent joke, but actually the way it can affect how people feel, and then the way it can affect our behaviors, actually then can become a lot more painful.
And I think just to expand on the example that you gave, I guess maybe starting off as this joke or something else is the image that outsiders out of the Khoja community have towards the Khojas, is that they are they're in a, they've shielded themselves just within their community, and they're not very inclusive of outsiders of other communities from the Muslim faith. Personally, I grew up hearing this, and I had no one to say, no, that's not the case, because I was in my own bubble, right? And so it really affected me. I'm just going to give you an example of how for me, a few months ago, I met a lovely Khoja lady who was telling me about medical trips that she does in Syria. And I was intrigued, and I really wanted to go, but she was telling me that everyone on that trip is going to be Khoja. And a part of me really wanted to go and serve, and it was very exciting, and I wanted to be there. But the thought of being with all these other people that are Khoja was a bit terrifying to me.
How many were there?
Pardon?
How many were there?
30.
30.
Yeah.
So one Iraqi and 30 Khojas.
30 Khojas. And I was really scared. And it's the one thing that I was questioning, not about going to Syria, but just about, are they going to be inclusive of me? Because I've heard otherwise. And luckily, I didn't listen to that voice, and I went. And when I tell you, they were the most amazing people. We left literally as one family. But that's one of the dangers, isn't it? Because with you having that joke, or with not you, as in with a person saying it within themselves, after a while, if you believe it, it's going to affect your own actions without you even realizing. And some actions that are really important for you, but unless you question it or someone else questions that thought that you have, it's just going to stick.
Absolutely. I mean that's that bias, which is sort of the subtitle of this show, really kicking into gear, and we don't realize the harms that those biases can then manifest themselves as. You've also reminded me of another example. So yesterday, I'm on the phone to my dad, and he's talking about plans for the year, and he's like, "Yeah, son, I'm planning to go to Umrah, inshallah, in October. Do you want to come?" And I was like, I've got these other kind of commitments and stuff, so I'm not sure. I was like, but which group are you planning to go with? And he starts reeling off, a list of, our traditional Shia groups that tend to go. And I said, Dad, would you consider one suggestion? How about going with a Sunni group for Umrah? He's like, what? And I said, listen, this was my reaction as well. But a few years ago, one of my good friends who's a Sunni invited me, and he said, why don't you come with us, and we'll take our families. And after that initial like what kind of catching my biases, like, I don't know if I can go with those guys. I thought, hang on, what have I got to lose? And actually, I've got a lot to potentially learn. And it was one of the most phenomenal experiences in terms of the dialogue we were able to have, the misconceptions that I was able to break down just because I had exposure to the group, but equally just the amount of misconceptions they had about Shias that we were able to break down. Just because you're in this spiritual journey together, you're walking towards the same goal, and you see those biases, the destructive biases, just melt away. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think honestly that's the importance of dialogue and communication. And whether it's on a podcast, whether it's just you and a friend, when it comes to raising awareness, we have been given so many tools, and we just need to use them wisely. Because like you said, unless you're hanging out together, unless you're talking about things and raising awareness and taking away misconceptions, those biases, subconsciously or consciously, are going to remain.
Yeah, and I think there's something about going beyond the conversation. The awareness gives you that platform to jump from, but then if you don't jump, you're sitting with an academic, intellectual awareness.
The jump is scary.
It is scary, absolutely, and hopefully, one of the outcomes, ideally for me, for anyone watching today's show, would be, go out there and take a little jump. Maybe not too big a jump, but just a little jump that helps you put yourself in the shoes of someone that's different, with the intention of saying, Ya Allah, I want to experience how I can manifest the dignity that every human has the right to receive from me.
I think that jump, it can be very small in the sense of just taking a step back and analyzing our past actions. Because one thing that you brought up at the beginning was the self-justification. And that's something that I think is really troublesome and scary. And once you start doing that, after a while, you don't realize that you're doing it. So I always just encourage myself, my kids, everyone, just to take some time back, reflect through your past actions and think, if you were in that situation again, how would you deal with it? How would you be more inclusive? How would you be more accommodating to those with various needs, so that when the opportunity arises again, you're not stuck on how to behave?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. There was a point that just really struck me several years ago when I was researching this for a lecture around the order of biases. So we all have biases, we all make judgments, many subconsciously, but there are patterns in terms of which biases people experience most frequently. And the number one kind of judgment that people make because of just what they tend to notice is about disability. So and that's physical disability. Followed by physical disability, it's race. So whether you like it or not, you notice, we're in many ways hardwired to notice someone's ability or disability. We're hardwired to notice the color of their skin, followed by their gender, followed by their age, and there are numerous other ones. Now, not saying that applies to every single person, but research shows that this is a general trend across cultures, across nationalities. So just knowing that actually that's part of my subconscious, that's something I'm noticing, means that actually I'm potentially empowered to say, if that's one of my go-to notices, what should I do with it before I make an automatic judgment that's not befitting of the dignity that I want to give?
So you're speaking about our unconscious biases and how it's hardwired and how we should be aware of it. But other than the unconscious biases that we have, what else stops us from being inclusive?
So I'd like to talk maybe a little bit more about the unconscious biases and the various tests you can do online that just help you to start recognizing and bring from the unconscious into the unconscious. And there's some great experiments you can do on the Harvard website online that will help you to be more aware of those blind spots that we can have. Beyond that, though, I think there are a lot of things that we have assumptions about, and these come from those community level biases, which is why it's not as innocent as saying this is just a joke between us, because it does have a broader impact. So there's the assumptions we make about others that we don't test out. You know, we're just happy to go along and believe what we believe, without asking, without putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, without exposing ourselves to different groups of people. But there's also a fear. And I think particularly when we talk about disabilities, there can be a fear of, you know what, like, I'm going to mess it up if I interact with them. Like, what if I offend them? What if I don't know what to do? And, you know, that fear is human. It's understandable. It's natural.
Yeah, it is natural and it is understandable, but then sometimes it causes harm. It's one of those things, like the example you gave of the pen accidentally being thrown, it's still going to hurt me. So whereas you might have a fear of how to deal with a person who, let's say, has a disability, a visible one in front of you, and you choose not to interact out of fear of upsetting them or offending them. That other side, though, however, might feel that you've chosen to not speak to them, and they might feel excluded based on your fear, which wasn't a negative, it wasn't with a negative intention, it was trying to be inclusive by not offending them, but then you've still managed to do that.
Absolutely. And this is where we come full cycle to what we started with, is putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Remembering a time where maybe we've been excluded and thinking, you know what, maybe that person just wasn't sure about how to approach us. Maybe they were fearful that, you know, when they see someone who looks like a Muslim, that he's just going to be a jihadi or something. Or, you know, a woman wearing a scarf is just going to be, you know, awkward or, you know, difficult to speak to in some way. And in the same way that we'd want them to take that risk, to say, you know what, just try me, you know, don't ignore me, is the same approach that we should then try and use to help us try and overcome our fear and say, let me try it.
Absolutely, and I think other than just try me is, worst case, ask me. We had a lady on the show not too long ago, and she was speaking about it's okay if you don't know how to interact with someone, just ask them. And she was saying that she had a friend who she regularly goes out for walks with, and she has issues with her eyesight, and some days are worse than others. And she said, when I do go out for a walk with her, I just ask her at the beginning, what would you need from me today? Would you like me to hold your hand or just be next to you? Just ask.
Yeah, absolutely. In the area that I work in, particularly in training other therapists, there was quite a strong movement around developing cultural competence. So, you know, being aware of what someone else's belief systems are, and, you know, the boundaries and what you should and shouldn't do. But I think one of the critiques and limitations of that approach to being culturally competent is that, you know, how many people's cultures are you going to know about? And actually what I'm finding is a more helpful approach, and that's not to say cultural competence doesn't have its own place, but is cultural humility. So just being curious and wanting to find out. You're not going to be attacked for not knowing everything, but it's fair for someone to feel offended or not respected by you if you're not willing to be curious.
I think that's something we witnessed in the World Cup.
Yeah.
Right? The whole cultural thing and the different attitudes people were coming to a new culture and doing that. And honestly, in terms of not knowing culture and how many cultures can you know, even though I'm Iraqi, every time I go back, I learn something else from my culture that I didn't know. So really, how much of an expectation can you have of others to be that knowledgeable about your culture?
Again, just focusing back on disabilities and maybe not just thinking about physical, observable, visible disabilities, but maybe thinking a little bit more about invisible disabilities. So I think something that's gaining more recognition now is maybe the area of ADHD, having being on the autistic spectrum, and some of those things that are maybe a bit less visible for people to see, but nevertheless may be there. And of course, if you can't notice it, it's easy to just make an assumption about someone. But I think there is something about just being curious, just being observant, and just picking up if someone's feeling maybe uncomfortable, not having to make an assumption about their attitude, but just being curious about, you know, are you okay? Is there anything I can help with?
Yeah, and I think relating that back to faith as well, you know, we have the saying from Imam Ali alayhi salam that says, if you see something off or someone doing wrong, find 70 excuses. We don't go by that. And I know that it might not be exactly in terms of what we're speaking about now, but I think it applies to everything. Don't be quick to judge. Don't be quick to say, oh, they acted in a really negative way, or oh, they were so quick to answer back, or they looked at me like this. Be open to the possibility that the explanation is something you can't see.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you quoted is bang on, you know, very relevant to what we're talking about here. I mean, the 70 can be argued to be metaphorical. You're not going to sit there and like, oh, number 1 and number 68.
By the time you come up with 70, you would have forgotten what the main issue was that you're trying to find excuses for.
But I think, you know, the wisdom I really see in that is that it's just a breeding ground for curiosity. Find out, ask, dialogue, and often when you have people with carers, not always, but often, they may be with someone who, if the person with the disability, you know, finds it difficult to talk about, or maybe, you know, is reluctant in any way, that perhaps the carer is equipped and skilled and able to kind of share with you as well. So, I mean, that can be helpful if you're not feeling really confident about kind of approaching the person with the disability. Maybe have a look to see who they're with, and perhaps use that as a way in to help you understand better.
Yeah, and I think whether you speak to the person directly or the person with the with them, they can tell if you're asking from for a genuine cause. Are you trying to have a better understanding, to try and be more inclusive, more accommodating, to see how you can help, or are you asking from a place of just to be rude or to make a scene? They can tell. And so if your intention is good, there's really nothing to worry about trying to get this piece of information from whoever it may be, as long as you're trying and doing it for the right reasons.
Absolutely. And if we can do that to help dismantle even a little bit of our bias, it can go a long way. I'm conscious that we've discussed bias on a few occasions here, but perhaps we haven't always, you know, broken down what we mean by bias, or experienced, you know, and recognized what some of our biases. That I wonder if we could just do a brief experiment, just to kind of highlight and explain what we might mean by bias. So what was the last car that you were driving?
The one I drive now? Or
the one before you were driving this?
A BMW.
Okay. You're no longer driving. Obviously, you've got a new car. So what are you driving now?
A Volvo.
Okay. So how did you go about making the decision to buy this Volvo?
Well, I crashed the BMW.
Alhamdulillah, you're still here to tell the tale?
Alhamdulillah. And that was a write-off. So I just I was told by numerous people that the Volvo was the safest car out there. And so I was like, I want to be safe. And I got the Volvo.
So now, when you were kind of looking for your new car, how long did it take?
Around 6 weeks.
6 weeks, yeah. And in those 6 weeks, what kind of cars were you noticing?
Volvos. Everywhere. Because I had it in my mind.
Yeah.
So I felt like all of a sudden all I was seeing was Volvos.
Well, every street turn you turn down, there's a Volvo. There's
Honestly,
a Volvo.
And not just every street in the UK, every country I went to, the Volvos were just in front of me.
So, you know, this is a really nice example of that bias we develop because of a particular experience we have. And I'm sure most of our viewers would recognize that, you know, when you really want something, you know, there's a phone or a bag or a car or whatever it is, you just start noticing it all the time. Now, the conspiracy theorists would say, you know, Volvo really want you to buy the car, and they, you know, Siri or something has heard you talking about it, and they're just placing cars everywhere. They don't have the resources to do that, and you buying one car is not going to warrant that expense. The alternative explanation is, you know what, this is just a bias in my mind, and I'm noticing it. So hopefully that's you know, a helpful way for viewers to relate to what we mean by bias, and how actually our biases are triggered by particular experiences.
And how it affects our daily life. Because I noticed I was seeing the Volvo everywhere, but until you phrased it the way you've just now, I didn't think it was a bias.
Right.
I didn't think it was, I just thought there's so many Volvos. But you're right, I think it's because that's where my mind was at, that I was ignoring everything else and just focusing on the thing I had in mind.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about the trigger around safety, it's not the only trigger. You know, there's many triggers for people's biases, but that can be a very powerful trigger, because, you know, we're built to survive. We're built to maintain our safety. And so when it comes to some of our biases, particularly in relation to people who are different, our bias can often be focused on what's threatening about the other. So a classic one that I've observed in people that I've spoken to is, you know what, like black people, they're all right, but you know what, some of them, they're quite involved in crime, and so I've got to watch it. And so of all the black people they come across, their bias focuses their attention on anything that looks shifty or dangerous, which then reinforces and perpetuates their own beliefs and sense of threat and their bias. So we're locked in a vicious cycle. We all have different biases, but how accurate are these, and how much of a justice or injustice do they end up doing?
I mean, the more you're giving examples, the more I'm thinking of things in my head. But if we are just going to discuss the biases that we have unconsciously, and you're saying how many of them do we have, what's the route we can take to analyze the biases we have? Is there tools for that? What do we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So like if anyone wants to do a Google search on unconscious bias test, that's going to flag up some useful tools for you. I guess from a more everyday perspective, whether you got access to a tool like that or not, and those tools have their own limitations, is just thinking about this process of how a bias gets you to tune into one part of someone or one part of a group of people. And if you're focused on one part of someone, then that means you're not focused on the other part of them.
And I think when it comes to disability, that's relevant to the whole label that's put based on the disability that they have. And focusing on that label alone means you just say, oh, ADHD, or oh, autism, or, instead of focusing on the whole person and everything that that person has, you just focus on that small aspect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, building on the discussion of, what can we do to limit our biases, is to try and see the whole person. For years, I've been running, groups for people who suffer from depression and various different sort of psychological difficulties. We always used to start off by saying, tell me about your depression. And then we found those groups would actually just become quite stuck. And one time someone suggested, this is a group of people who are experiencing depression. They're not a group of depressed people. Now it's a subtle difference, but it's a significant difference. And so actually what we started doing was asking everyone, say, can you tell us something about you outside of the experience of depression? And actually those groups became a lot less stuck, and people were able to start connecting with their own identity beyond what had become their gaze, and often the gaze of other people. And I think that applies just as much to any other area of bias, and in particular what you've highlighted about people with disabilities, and especially visible disabilities.
But it's so interesting what you said, because exactly, I think that having a bias is not just something that an outsider has towards you. Sometimes it is you towards yourself. And that's even trickier. Do you have clients like that? How do you support them?
Absolutely. This kind of brings me on to a bit of a discussion around compassion. Compassion that we can have for ourselves, and compassion that we can have for others. And often we might have compassion for others, but lack compassion for ourselves. Now, when we recite the Holy Quran, we talk about the Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and once you look at the Holy Quran, replete with examples and stories of compassion. And looking at the biggest mercy to mankind, and thinking about one of the reasons he was able to do what he'd done was because of the compassion he held in his heart. So it's of huge significance, and I in my opinion, it's quite under discussed as an important facet of Islam. I think when you go to something like Buddhism, it's all about compassion, yeah. And then you don't always hear about what else is part of that faith. It's a huge part of our faith, and like to use this platform to flag it as warranting more attention.
No, absolutely, and especially because we grow up hearing the stories, but also the more you we grow up and do our own research as well. The Prophet was compassionate to everyone, not just Muslims. And that's the stories that I think we hear, but we sometimes need to take a step back and analyze. We hear constant stories of, the person who was throwing rubbish on the Prophet, peace be upon him, someone from another gender, someone from another faith, and still him going to visit them and checking up on them. And that's just the first example that came to mind. But we're surrounded by examples of how he was so compassionate to everyone around him, regardless of their nationality, of the color of their skin, of their religion, and how he was just kind.
Absolutely. I mean, he's a beacon individual, and that's a great role model for us. I mean, sometimes people say, yeah, I want to be more compassionate, but I don't know how to be more compassionate. And often what can be helpful is to try and draw on an experience of compassion that you've had. Now, some people have been through really difficult experiences in life, but even those people usually have encountered someone who's been compassionate towards them. And I guess to cultivate compassion in your own heart, sometimes it's not an intellectual exercise to say this is what I should do or shouldn't do. It's about sometimes getting in touch with your senses. So I'm going to try another brief exercise with you, if you're willing to have a go. And for any viewers to join in. And maybe just to close your eyes for a second. And maybe just kind of float back into your life to a point where you can hear the voice of someone compassionate. And it could be a teacher, it could be a colleague, a friend, a family member. Any voice that you can hear, Zainab?
My mom.
Your mom, yeah. Now, I'm not going to ask you what she says that's compassionate, but when she's been compassionate to you at a time where you've experienced difficulty, but she's been there to support you and be compassionate, what did her voice sound like?
It's very soothing. It's a very soothing, calm voice.
Could you maybe, if you could describe the voice as a shape, what sort of shape would it be?
Wave, a very nice wave, no sharp edges.
Smooth.
Yeah, flowing.
And in terms of the pitch of the voice, could you describe that?
It's a low pitch.
The pace of the voice?
Not too slow, not too fast.
Maybe the color of the voice?
I'm going to go for orange. I don't know why.
Is it a sort of a bright, luminous orange, or is
no,
it
it's
like
a pale. It's a pale
pale
orange. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that with me. You can just open your eyes, bring yourself back to the room. What I was just trying to do there, and hopefully any viewers who might have been able to join in, is just to connect with that experience of compassion in a slightly more visceral way. Yeah. In addition to just what did it look like and what did they say. Compassion is more than an intellectual exercise. It's an emotional exercise. It's something we feel in our body. And so in terms of being able to try and develop and nurture some self-compassion, actually connecting with that voice, not being too focused on the words, but just that tone, the sound of that voice, and applying it to myself. When I'm going through a bit of a difficult time, am I just going to start kind of beating myself up about it, or actually can I connect with that? And can I connect with the ultimate source of that compassion, which, whether it was your teacher, your mum, your friend, actually that compassion was still a manifestation of the blessing that they received from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a very emotional exercise, even though it didn't, it may have not looked like it. And I know you said not to share what was being said, but I just want to point out, I think, to the viewers, and I'm sure you already know, the example that came to my head is at least 12 years ago. And it's actually something I hadn't thought of for a very long time, but it comes with feelings as well. I mean, I know you said to think of it in shapes and colors, but it comes with feelings of security and a lot of other positive feelings.
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting exercise. I definitely recommend the viewers to do that.
Inshallah, inshallah.
Thank you for that.
Just one of the barriers that people can have when it comes to being compassionate with themselves or even with others is that they confuse what compassion is actually supposed to be. And they'll often conflate compassion with saying, no, everything's okay. But actually, most people who've had an authentic experience of compassion, when they're down, the compassionate person isn't telling you that it's okay to be down. They're just with you while you're down, but with you to get you back up. So compassion isn't saying we're going to let you off the hook and you don't have to do anything, which some people confuse it with and say, no, we don't want to be soft. Compassion isn't about being soft. Compassion is about being loving, gentle, but moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, going back one step, you said some people struggle with being compassionate and kind to themselves, but they are with others. That's definitely the case, but I think the opposite is also the case. Sometimes people are very easygoing on themselves, their expectations they have of themselves, or justifying any wrongdoings, even to their close family members and friends, but are very quick to use a very negative lens to analyze and think about everyone else's actions.
Yeah.
So they're both, how do we try and bridge that gap?
Yeah. Often that disparity between being compassionate toward others but not the self, or being compassionate to the self and not others, goes back to earlier life experiences. And I would say this as a psychologist invested in those models of understanding how the past does impact on our future. And I don't think that's in contradiction to what we believe in Islam as well. We place so much emphasis on the importance of a healthy upbringing, a supportive upbringing, the valuable role of parenting, the rights that children have over their parents, and so in bridging this gap, when people maybe are quite compassionate to themselves but seem to lack compassion to other particular groups, often you can trace that back to an experience that might have been quite threatening, sometimes traumatizing for them. And so being able to sort of go back and think, that's how I made sense of my experience with a particular group, with a particular type of person at a time. Does that experience really reflect the entirety of that group? So
you brought up trauma, and it's always brought up as an explanation or as a word when we're trying to analyze people's actions or why people behave a certain way. Does it really have such a big effect?
I think increasingly, healthcare professionals are recognizing, social care professionals are recognizing that the challenges that people experience, traumatic experiences that they have early in life, they leave an imprint. Alhamdulillah, we're blessed to develop, to be really adaptable to our circumstances. But adaptation doesn't mean that you're fulfilling the trajectory you would have always had. Adaptation means you're working around it. So we make the best with our neuroplasticity, but that doesn't mean that what we experienced is obliterated. It's gone away, and exactly. It leaves an imprint.
Now, going back to the biases, we did speak about the subconscious biases that we can have, whether it's based on trauma, whether it's based on experiences or community. Are there other kinds of biases that affect the inclusivity that we have within our communities or within, on a larger scale? Are there perhaps systemic biases? What is the role of society and the community when it comes to biases and the bias blocks?
No, absolutely. So I guess in linking bias and inclusivity, when the interpersonal biases start manifesting, we start joking or demeaning or devaluing certain people, that starts then affecting the way we think as a group, and that then starts affecting the systems we put in. When we are exclusive, intentionally or unintentionally, we don't take into account certain needs. Now, just giving you a very practical example. Someone has a hearing impairment. They come into a community centre. That community centre was designed by who? People, you may assume,
didn't have a hearing
impairment. So actually their design process is unintentionally excluding that person with a hearing impairment. Now, having a hearing loop installed in the design of the building from the outset, because you were considerate, because you were inclusive, actually means that no one's, that at least that group of people are not left out. And so that's an example of how something more systemic or structural can manifest the biases and the exclusivity that you end up with when you just look at your own perspective.
I think going to the example that you gave, it would be great if they had thought about, the people who are going to come to the center with a hearing impairment, but it may have not crossed their mind. And I think that's why the role of research and asking your community members and everyone what they need is so important from the onset, instead of always, designing everything, like you said, following your example, and then being like, oh, this person's struggling, okay, let's fit this in. Because that, even if the issue is fixed, it still left that person feeling like it was done just for them, like they had to fight for their right, maybe something like that. Again, it's not going to give that really nice feeling of being included from the onset.
Absolutely. If I extend the example and link it back to a concept that we mentioned, at the start of the show around respect. So imagine you're kind of setting up your business. Alhamdulillah, you're going to be employing a range of employees, including maybe some Muslims. Are you going to, in that design phase, incorporate a space for prayer? Yeah. Now, someone who, regardless of whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, because having a place for prayer is a legal requirement, in our legal system here in the UK, the way you go about it can be really different, and it has an impact on the recipient. If you were to design a really beautiful, it doesn't have to be huge, but just clean, well laid out, close to washing facilities, place for prayer, whoever uses that is going to feel that they were considered, that they feel respected. And their motivation to engage in that organization is going to be very different to someone whose place of prayer is like a dusty old cupboard where they keep the brooms and the paint and like the cleaning products.
I think that feeling stays with you. Imagine going in on your first day asking for a prayer room, seeing it there ready, compared to, the second example you gave of the dusty room. No matter what happens, issues goes forward. Like any issue that they have, the employer and the business that you said, it's always going to be like, I knew this. They were like this from the beginning, even when it came to the prayer room. And I think that's dangerous as well, because we start connecting dots that are not necessarily actually connected, but that worsens the situation.
Yeah. Now, just building on this example, moving from an employment environment back to a community center, when it comes to the design and maybe the adaptation of our community centers, are we doing it with the intention of being tolerating of those people with the disabilities, or actually with a respect for their dignity and their right to access this place as much as I have the right to access this place? And that makes a huge difference in the way we do it, and even the way we might explain and welcome the use of these facilities to someone with a disability. Having like a different setup, having a ramp, for example, in and of itself isn't the only answer. How you welcome someone to using that ramp, how much you make it a big deal. Or, look, I've done something great. I've done you a favor.
Expecting a thank you.
Well, hang on, that was your right.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to make a big deal of it. I'm just going to say, welcome to using what's yours.
Yeah. These are very ideal standards, but unfortunately it's not always the case. But if there were people watching the show now and thinking, I want to uncover my biases, I want to be more inclusive, I want to be more accommodating from the very beginning, so that everyone has equal opportunities and everyone feels valued and respected, what advice would you give to them? Where would they start?
So I'd go back to where we started our conversation, which was talking about human dignity. And you can only really recognize human dignity if you can recognize a human, which is different to recognizing an object. I could be objectifying you as, you're just a hijabi, you're just a talk show host, without understanding that, you've got a family, you've got your own aspirations, you've got your own needs and desires, which helps me kind of hold you in mind as a whole person. Yeah, viewers could be objectifying me, like, he's the psychologist, he just lectures and does therapy, but actually not recognize that actually there's so much more to me than that. And in a similar way, I guess the endeavor that we can take to seeing through what's skin deep into who someone is, trying to get to connect with their soul, make a connection with them, understand who they are, can be a huge step in breaking through that barrier, breaking through the biases, and respecting their God-given dignity.
Do you have any positive stories you'd be willing to share about a person who was on this journey, where they started off, do you have any stories like that? Because it's something that sounds lovely, and I'm sure everyone listening would be like, I want to do it, but it's kind of, change is scary, and trying to analyze yourself and think about things in a deep level is sometimes challenging. But when you hear of stories of people who've done it and the goodness that has come out of it, I think it makes it a bit more encouraging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, a range of stories, but I think some of the common themes that I guess would come out in some of these stories, and I can just highlight one or two of them, is around gender and around faith. And people had this one person who was going into a class, was very confident about what they knew and was looking forward to taking their learning to the next level, and they saw as the teacher's a black woman. Okay, biases kick in. What am I going to learn from this person? And actually largely switched off, was wasting their time, started making comments, and actually was expecting, was trying to bait the person into exposing that they don't know much, that there's nothing much to add. But that teacher was so patient with them, was able to show a level of care and respect that actually surprised this person, make them sit up and take notice. And it got to a point where, after some reflection, they were able to come to terms with the biases that they had, just because of the level of interaction they had with that person, where they're able to go and apologize to them, open up to them, and actually have a beautiful relationship.
It sounds like a wonderful story, but I think I might have a slight issue if it implies that the person who has to go and prove themselves is the person who the bias is against. So this teacher had she was probably definitely qualified, she had experience, she was there with the right intention. A student comes with a negative bias towards her, and she has to go out and about, out of her way, to try and take that bias. And some people might be like that. Some people might have that extra energy to give, to try and take away misconceptions and to help people. Not everyone has that, and the expectation shouldn't be on them.
Absolutely. The onus should always be on us as individuals to challenge our own biases, to not wait for someone to prove it. And I think that goes back to us looking at our role models. And who is it they engage with? Were they testing people? What is it our faith is? And looking at some of our beacon institutions as well as beacon individuals like Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It kind of reminds me of the proactive approach that a beacon institution that I've just been learning a little bit more about recently. So the Al Ain Foundation has some schools, some educational facilities in Iraq, which were designed from the ground up in consultation with a range of professionals that took into account the needs of the students right from the outset. And I think that's a beautiful example of actually not waiting until the students come in and then thinking about what are their needs, but actually being proactive. And I think, going back to your point about not waiting for people to have to prove themselves or not putting the burden on them, but actually carrying that responsibility ourselves.
Absolutely. I think that's the main point. And I feel like this conversation could go on and on, but unfortunately we only have around 2 minutes left. So is there any final pieces of advice, anything that you want to share?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of being inclusive, I think, as you've just highlighted with this last point, that the starting point has to be the mirror. And being brave enough to be curious, to ask questions, and to offer that self-compassion that we might have to others. To be aware that actually if we don't do it by just sitting on the fence, the reality is that we can cause harm, and that's hopefully a good motivator, as well as the motivation of being able to share our love, that then allow us to have that common human dignity.
Absolutely. And I think, just going back to one of the first points we made, is that this is what our faith asks us to do. It's a symbol of being Muslim, to be compassionate, to be inclusive, to be accommodating to everyone, and not leave people feeling left out based on their disabilities or their extra special needs, as well as other things. It's been a very informative talk. Thank you so much for your time coming. I really appreciate all the knowledge that you've shared. And thank you so much to our viewers. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Out of Sight. Inshallah, we will be back very soon. Until then, thank you, take care, and ma'a salama.